Good afternoon, everyone. Apologize for being a few minutes late. We were taping a program with Professor Telesetsky, so we just got done. So again, I apologize for being a few minutes late. So let's get right into it because I don't want to waste anyone's time. We are very fortunate today to be joined by Cal Poly Professor Anastasia Telesetsky. She's written a report for California 100, which is an initiative looking at California's future, and her report focused on California ag. If you would, Lupe, at some point, maybe give the link to that report in the chat room, so people, if they want to read the report, they can do that. But with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Professor Telesetsky for her general comments and remarks. Talk for 30 or 40 minutes, however long you'd like, and then we can open up to Q&A.
Thanks very much. So I have a few PowerPoints that I was going to put up just to sort of give a few visuals and sort of walk through. But before I do that, I just am going to mention sort of how this report, the California 100 organization is a pretty interesting organization that has reports on a lot of different topics. And when they were going through the process, they originally had one on environmental and natural resources. And they realized that basically looking at the sort of agricultural sector and the food sector in particular, that area was not being covered by like the business report or being covered by the natural resources report. So this was a latecomer. This was a latecomer in terms of the process of the report. So I worked on this from March, very kind of tight frame. So not every topic may be covered in the detail one may have desire in such a report. The idea was to create 4 scenarios that would present different kind of visions of what might be happening in the space of food systems. So I'm going to share a couple slides here and then open it up for a bigger conversation here. So the topic, of course, is the future of California's food systems. We know that California is a major player when it comes to the U.S.'s food system. The U.S. exported about $124 billion worth of food. Among those products, almonds, pistachios, and milk. And those are products that I'll be showing in just a moment. California is a national leader. We ship to a lot of different places. We ship to Asia, we ship to the European Union. We have a broad market. Of course, we do a great deal of trade with our northern neighbor and our southern neighbor also. But there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of tension around this global agriculture because we're producing, I'll just give you an example of where some of that tension might lie. We have 5 counties that, of course, are California's predominant almond producers. But these same counties are also heavily reliant on irrigated agriculture water. And there is a tension between water use and production for export markets, because some argue that we are exporting our limited water. Which brings me to sort of show you where we are in terms of our production here in California. You can see the sales and you can see the ranking. We are #1 for fruits and vegetables, nuts and berries, and milk. I wanted you to see, because I think it is interesting, because I'll come to this point a little bit later, we are #5 in aquaculture. Most of that is freshwater aquaculture, but one of the sort of proposals in sort of projecting where California might be going is to begin to think a little bit more about marine aquaculture. From the history point of view, one of the things that I was requested to do in this report was to look at California's agricultural history. And there are some interesting themes that sort of emerge when you are looking particularly at how history might be in some ways repeating itself, and sort of what does that tell us about where we might be moving as a state in the future. Our earliest history with agriculture in this state is troubling in some ways. We, of course, displaced large groups of indigenous populations with the mission movement, moving with the Spanish missions that was set up along the coast from San Diego north. The mission movement led to indigenous people being forced out of their traditional foodways into growing food for the missions, cultivating food, plus participating heavily in ranching. We were, as a state, based in part on some of the efforts of the missions, and then the subsequent takeover with the Mexican land grants. We became a very early export market. We were exporting cattle from across the state to other parts of the world, plus of course the US. A lot of our cattle were going out not necessarily as food, but for the leather, the hides. And then we were one of the leading wheat producers in the late 1890s and the early 1900s. So one of the themes that I just want us to sort of have and part of this kind of discussion is that we are a big global food exporter, and we have been for decades. Early mechanization has been very important. We have been using mechanization for wheat production initially, but now, of course, for many other parts of the agricultural enterprise. And I think that is reflected today. We're seeing increasing interest in using robotics and in using artificial intelligence to be able to improve some of our agricultural yields and to our sustainability. We've always been experimenters. Early on, the state was investing money in trying to bring in new crops and try new things. You know, California has always been on the kind of forefront. A great example is the Brazilian orange that sort of helped to launch the citrus industry here in California. And so kind of maybe a modern day example of that is kind of the new proteins that we're seeing. A lot of companies, the Beyond Burger, Impossible Burger, and other kinds of companies like that, who are trying to figure out sort of new foods, new essential kind of commodities. We have all been intensively growing crops here, particularly starting in the early, the beginning of the 20th century. And a lot of that was because of financialization. The banks have been involved with some of the decisions that have been made for what will be grown and how it will be grown because of concerns on kind of financial returns. And banking capital today continues to fuel agricultural production. That, you know, maybe decisions that a farmer might want to make, they have decisions that they also have to make based on loans that they might have. For a particular year. There's tons of challenges, and I think everyone on this call is familiar with what those challenges are, and I'm just highlighting a few of them here before I talk about what the scenarios were that I have sort of designed as part of this report. Of course, we have water shortages, and we can talk about that at length. I thought this particular image is interesting because those red dots show where we have loss of irrigated agricultural land. I mean, that has, and probably, and from my perspective, the number one challenge that California faces right now in terms of agricultural productivity is finding sources of water and finding reliable sources of water. And you can see that, you know, California is not alone in losing irrigated acreage, but how that will be replaced is sort of a different question. Labor shortages. This is a increasing concern. I apologize, it's shortages. Fewer farm workers are coming here to the US, and we find that, you know, existing farm workers are finding new jobs. So if you look here in California, I just took the numbers from the crop production workers between 2011 and 2021, and you can see that there is a sort of sizable decline over the years in terms of how many crop production workers we have. Now, part of that may be that we're beginning to see some mechanization emerging. That may be what is explaining these numbers, but some of this may also be the wages. The wages are very difficult to find still be living wages here in this state, even with improved minimum wages for farm workers. There are concerns also about benefits. Here in California, at least the self-reporting from some of the farm worker groups is that not all farm workers are entitled to have access, I should say, to the same benefits, so that there are farm workers who say they don't have access to unemployment benefits and they don't have access to workers' compensation. And some of this may also, there are various reasons that could be explaining this, involving, documentation, whether they're documented or undocumented workers. But the point being is that fewer farm workers are coming here to the US. An increasing challenge is warming. We know, of course, climate change is manifesting itself in many different ways in this state, which one of these is warming, lengthier droughts. These multi-year droughts. California historically has had multi-year droughts. If you look back, decades back. But not necessarily with the same number of heat waves per year, the days that we're experiencing heat waves, and the intensity that we are experiencing heat waves. So this is from a report in Nature looking at, in this particular case, inland urban California. What does this mean for crop production? This is challenging when we think about winter chill hours. Different crops need different amounts of winter chill at particular, 40 degrees or less for particular crops. So pistachios, for example, need about 700 to 1,000 hours of winter chill, and the projections are that particularly in some of the big pistachio growing areas, that we're not going to have that amount of chill. So it's going to make it really difficult in terms of the current trees, the being able to sort of fruit and produce nuts. So the warming is a definitive concern. Related to this, of course, is wildfire. Have increasing amounts of wildfire that will affect the quality of food, as well as affect the ability of many workers to be able to do their work, depending on the amount of particulate pollution that might be in the air on a particular day. A more recent sort of set of research has been done on the potential flooding effects that might be happening here in California, where, in some places we have too little water, and other places we might end up with too much water. With atmospheric rivers, if you get too much water at particular times during crop cycles, you might end up weakening a particular crop, flooding a particular crop, and leading to lower yields. So this is one of those issues also that is out there. We have, in terms of our water supply and storage, we have, this is just a map showing the different water projects, the Central Water Project and the State Water Project. The challenge, of course, is that this is our surface water delivery. We don't have enough surface water to meet all of the existing water rights, particularly if all owners of water rights were to actually make a call on their rights. Meaning that many farmers, of course, turn to using groundwater if they have groundwater available to them. The groundwater in this particular image from the Department of Water Resources indicates where we have decreasing trends, and the red areas in particular, if you're looking in the Central Valley, are concerning because this is a trend towards reduced available groundwater without any replacement source. For folks who are coming to us today from the Central Valley, of course, you see this impact directly with some farmers fallowing, others having to remove orchards. which brought me to the scenarios, and I'm looking forward to sort of hearing your thoughts about scenarios also. I'm just using the 2x2 grid here, the policy grid, looking at whether it is, there is water or there isn't water, whether California was able to adapt to climate change or less able to adapt to climate change. And one of these scenarios, of course, is the insufficient water and the failure to adapt to climate change, and that's bleak. That's bleak. It basically means that California will be moving out of the agricultural space because it simply will not be able to raise the kinds of crops that it has historically. The other three are on a sort of spectrum of more of positivity, in the sense that they're somewhat adaptive scenarios. We have one where we have enough water available, but we have inability to necessarily grow here in California, but we're using our water for other purposes. And I can talk about that in a moment. The other two, this land of milk and honey, looks at a kind of long-term water investments where we've actually made investments and created the technological innovations that will lead to the ability to support our agricultural sector. But we can also do that even if we don't have enough water, as long as we're taking steps to adapt to climate change. So in that sense, there's a positive message there that at the end of the day, we don't necessarily need to find external sources of water, but we do need to be able to use the water that we have as precisely as possible. And so that may lead to sort of different ways of creating crops and not creating, but cultivating crops, different ways of generating food products. This Canadian hothouse and Mexican avocado scenario, I give you just an example. We're already doing a fair amount of importing of these types of food items from other countries. In this scenario, the idea is that California, as a state, has made decisions that it wants to use its water for other uses, whether that is, for municipalities to grow, whether that is to create more habitat, wetlands, whatever that might be. But it is a move away from the agricultural sector. The land of milk and honey, this is a more, optimistic, and this image I present here is because I'm going to talk about a few kind of policy ideas at the end here, was to examine possibly repurposing. In this scenario, we have adapted to climate change, meaning that we probably have a fair amount of renewable energy that is online. We may have moved to other fuel sources, and having moved to other fuel sources, we have a huge infrastructure associated with oil and gas pipelines. And if that was the case, we might be able to repurpose some of those to be able to transport water from areas that might have excess precipitation events westward. There is conversation about this. Arizona has been looking, the state of Arizona has been looking seriously at this kind of repurposing. There's obviously no traction on the ground with this, but this was kind of thinking out 50 years. The final sort of more positive of the scenarios was looking at new kinds of products, beginning to look at, for example, alternative proteins. There's a lot of players who are entering this space, ranging from doing things with vegetable proteins, looking at doing cellular-based meat or cellular-based seafood, looking at using mycoproteins, looking at algal proteins. There's a lot of work right now for seaweed, microalgae and macroalgae for animal feed, but also this could be a market for increasing interest for human, direct human food products. There's talk also of increasing insect protein, that's been explored, and all of this would kind of be Innovation Nation. I'll be honest, the innovation that I'm probably most excited about that, there is a fair amount of discourse around is the indoor farming, the vertical farming, the ability to do sort of environmentally controlled farming. We have companies that are in this space already here in California, and potentially for areas like the Central Valley, if you're not getting chill hours on certain kinds of crops, perhaps it would be possible to move some of those indoors and to have a sort of a climate controlled environment. So that kind of brings me to some priority steps. These are things that I think need to happen long before 2050, because that was the date that we were sort of projecting out to, I was projecting out to in creating scenarios. We need to understand our infrastructure at a really, really granular level. There is waste that's happening across the agricultural industry, whether that's leaving crops in the field for understandable reasons, because there may not be an immediate market for certain crops. Labor is expensive. We have water that's leaking all over the place in California at the very sort of granular level. And taking a look and making those kinds of repairs and seeing what kind of efficiencies we can get there as a sort of priority step. We need to have more conservation practices in play across the industry at large, looking at what the potential might be for cover cropping, particularly to be able to retain more moisture in soil. In areas where evapotranspiration is become problematic, because the more and more we dry out the soil, the more difficult it is to do any kind of restoration work. And soil is one of those challenges that we're having, is keeping, of course, fertile soil. We need to also be investing in research, and that's, I know a number of you are from the academy, and we need to be doing as much research as possible on how we can do multi-trophic aquaculture, how we can do fermentation, how we can do this in an energy efficient fashion, because that's often the challenge with some of these more innovative new food products. There are things that are more sort of long-term that we might want to be thinking about. Some of these are, so these are all things involving the kind of water system, improving our water system. So we might have that kind of milk and honey scenario. Our water rights system. Our water rights system's a mess right now. It's become a source for, the whiskeys for drinking, waters for fighting, absolutely here. And it's leading to the inability in some instances for groups to be able to work as cooperatively as they might otherwise be able to work. We need to possibly repurpose fossil fuel pipelines at some point in the future. We need more work with long-term sustainability, possibly with mini desal, looking at that for groundwater. There is technology out there, whether it can be sort of scaled up. That's the question in light of our energy needs as well as our water needs. In terms of looking at the issues with the kind of conservation point here, I think that we need a lot more work that's being done to make sure public safety, people feel comfortable with new foods, because they are being developed. They're often being developed for the right reasons, that we want to be able to conserve water. We want to be able to use less pesticides where we can. And we need to make sure that they're safe for consumption, and that that we get the FDA approval on some of these new products, particularly things like cellular meat and cellular fish. We need more regulatory oversight on synthetic biology research because there's public concerns about doing some of the kind of biotech work around our food products and making sure that, when people are using different kinds of technologies, whether they're going to use something like CRISPR or other types of technologies, that there is kind of some sort of oversight with that. And that there is public buy-in. And I'm particularly interested in aquaculture, so I think we need a lot more collaboration to be able to begin to build out multi-trophic aquaculture operations along our coast. A lot of our coastal areas would definitely benefit from economic development, and this is something that California has not done. It has investigated, but has not done particularly extensive investments in. And then I'm a fan of vertical farming because I do think it is something that can help to address needs for the industry, as well as being able to bring agriculture at scale into communities where we might have food insecurity. So those are just some of the ideas that I'm sort of throwing out there. I think I put this last little quote in from an author that I appreciate. She talks about how do you get these kind of food movements started? Well, you take the courage and you just take those steps together. And that's something that I think is important for the industry at large. We obviously we're in a transition period. Whether we like it or not, we're in a transition period. And as individuals begin to take those leadership positions, and we're seeing people do that right now as we speak, we're going to be able to make these kind of transformations and hopefully deliver kind of a land of milk and honey. So I invite your questions, and I also invite your comments. So I'll stop sharing, and I look forward to just a dialogue.
Thank you, Professor Telesetsky. Everyone, just to kind of reiterate, just use the chat room and write your questions or raise your hand, and we'll have you. We'll bring you in, but I'll get things started. There are a few things that you mentioned in your report and comments I just wanted to follow up on. One was this idea, which I've never heard before, frankly, is repurposing, oil and gas pipelines for water transfer. Hearing all the floods in the Midwest part of the country, or the Southeast, whatever, and then transporting that water to California. And how realistic is that?
It's not realistic right now because we're still using that infrastructure for fossil fuel and gas. But the theory being, at least in that scenario, is that we've moved on to other sources of energy, and we'd simply, have the pipelines then available. It technically possible, but it would be a question of, whether those states would also be wanting to have water pumped, whether there would be a new way of possibly having water markets.
It's interesting too. I think a lot of the workers that work on the pipelines then could take that work, would be transferable to work on a water pipeline, as it were. So that might be hit two birds with one stone. I mean, you're getting water to where it needs to be. You're also helping people who are losing jobs in one industry moving into a second industry. So it potentially could be a solution. Another thing I had a question about was this aquaculture. And excuse my ignorance, but what exactly is aquaculture? Is that Starkist? What is it? Chicken of the sea? What is that?
Oh, no, there's a whole lot of different kinds of aquaculture. So right now, California does a lot of freshwater aquaculture, and it's begun to make some investments also in things like finfish, so marine aquaculture. Most of the proposals out of this project, we're looking at marine aquaculture. There's different kinds of doing this, different ways of doing this. So Humboldt, for example, they're Nordic, I think it's called Nordic Salmon is the company. They are in the process right now of beginning to open a recirculating aquaculture system that's an indoor facility. It has some water that is being some ocean and coastal water that will be involved, but it's also operating indoors. I'll apologize because some of you folks may know all of the technical details on that, but these are some of the models that are beginning to get some play here. There's interest, I know, here in the Central Coast and reopening an abalone aquaculture facility. that would include abalone and fish and seaweed and a mix of different species. And the idea is that a lot of this is really high quality protein, with the added bonus if you're doing things like oysters and other clams and things like that. They're also cleaning the water. So
we've got some questions already, but I want to jump in. I want to ask one more question, if I might, take moderator privilege here. I just want to ask you really quickly about organic farming. I think I noticed in your report it's increasing by like 22%. So pretty significant. Is that, or do you see more of that in the future for California agriculture?
Definitely. I think definitely. I think a lot of folks are entering that space because they're getting a premium on their commodity. So I do see more farmers, and there's been an excellent job with marketing of California produce. And so there's an understanding that what you're getting from California, it's high quality. There are environmental protections in play. And that I do believe that more and more farmers will be moving towards at least.
Yeah, I've always thought that ag, now I'm not an ag expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I always thought that it would be a good idea for Valley agriculture to really mark themselves, kind of like Idaho potatoes. The best agriculture comes from the Valley, and create kind of a brand identity around Valley agriculture. I want to get some folks in here. Alex, you have your hand raised. Go ahead and ask your question. Then Mark Borba had a question. I'm going to do a follow-up, but go ahead, Alex, ask your question.
Thank you, Mr. Keppler, and thank you for your time, ma'am. I did want to ask, what are the opportunities for water recycling, and how can we also bridge the gap in access to this technology for all of California, particularly in the Valley?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so water recycling, we're beginning to see more repurposed wastewater. This is just beginning to sort of ramp up because it's expensive right now. And it requires a fair amount of planning to make sure that the water would be safe for to be applied to crops, that would then be consumed. So a lot of this is different. Particularly, we're seeing this with the sustainable groundwater agencies. That is one of the strategies that a number of the agencies are incorporating into their plans. And the Department of Water Resources has been articulating this as one of the strategies to be able to ensure that California will have sufficient water to meet its needs. So this is a priority. This is at this point a statewide priority.
It's not surprising that water is going to dominate this conversation. Mark Borba, I'm going to read the question exactly as he wrote it, because I think he would let me know if I took editorial license. So I'll read it the way he wrote it. He asks, where is the improved management of our existing surface water infrastructure through adaptive real-time management operation of the state federal pumps based on current daily data versus the premature scheduling of pumping and thus diversion of delta flows to the ocean, ? What efficiencies can be gained?
Oh, that's a pretty technical question. I think that's outside of my wheelhouse.
I think if I understand it, and Mark, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what he's basically saying is, instead of doing these kind of projections in the future, why can't they have technology that says daily, here's the water flow, and be more precise about what water needs to flow into the delta to keep it flushed out and keep it clean, but also then allow it to divert some of that water to Valley agriculture, or more of that water to Valley agriculture?
No, it makes sense to me because, yeah, I mean, given what, every day, you don't know if you had a recent precipitation event, it all makes sense that you doing something on a kind of daily basis, perhaps even an hourly basis, would be a possibility for something like that. But no, thank you for that comment.
I think water technology is becoming increasingly, it's always was important, just becoming increasingly more so with the effects of climate change, because you're having, drier periods and also wetter periods, right? It's these extremes, and how do you regulate that and still get the water you need? By the way, Mas Masamoto makes a comment on the chat section. He's in favor of organics from what I'm reading his points here. So that's good that we're moving somewhat in that direction. So what about the farm labor issue? I mean, that's also another big issue. Do you see, with the increase, with overtime rates now being applied to farm labor, with the potential of having more unionization of farm labor, though, like I mentioned, and we talked earlier, it's a very low percentage now. It's under 1% of farm labor is actually organized. But as they drive up the price to farm labor, isn't there going to be a real push toward mechanization?
That push is already happening. I mean, we're already seeing at least some of the larger farm owners looking into, I'll give an example here from the kind of Central Coast area, particularly for strawberries. There's a lot of interest in having strawberries that will be picked, by these very large machines, using artificial intelligence, being able to see what's ripe and not ripe, So we're already seeing that underway. In some ways, there's always going to be farm labor. There's always going to be farm labor. The one thing that may change in the years to come is it may be what those farm workers are doing. They may be doing maintenance on a machine. They may be doing programming on a machine. So these are going to be very kind of different tasks. And one of the things I'm just going to throw out there is I do think, what you're learning in a degree that has something to do with agriculture is radically changing. It's going to be radically changing in the decade to come.
Yeah, I think one of the issues too is as agriculture relies more and more on technology and in a replacement for labor as well, you're going to have ag workers that have that technical skill, so that the upskilling of agriculture workers is becoming increasingly important. Dale, why don't you go ahead and ask your question, and then Howard has a question that I'll read in a second, but Dale, go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Ms. Telesetsky. I wanted to first say I like your quote from Frances Moore Lappe, and I have a favorite recipe from her book called Recipes for a Small Planet. What I was wondering about the vertical farming, are you thinking of using all the abandoned warehouses I see we have for vertical farming? And if you penciled it out, how will the economics work out, please?
You've got a great question there. And yeah, that would be an ideal sort of location. I mean, right now, to give you an example of a place in Switzerland, they're using an old bunker from World War II to do kind of vertical farming production. So you can repurpose buildings. Obviously, you'd have to sort of redesign the buildings depending on whether you're because there's a lot of different ways of doing indoor farming. Some can be done more with like a greenhouse, where you'd have more sort of panels to let natural sunlight in. Some do not have any natural sunlight, but they're relying all on LEDs and other sorts of lighting arrangements. So there's a kind of a variety of possibilities for how this could be done. And your really, really great question is the economics. That's a question that a lot of people are asking.
Yeah, well, being part Swiss, I'm glad to hear that the Swiss are doing innovative things in this area. Howard has a follow-up question on something I talked about in terms of transporting water through these pipelines. He's saying, what about getting Congress to approve an I-10 pipeline from Florida to California? I guess we'll have to get Governor DeSantis on board on this. Powered by solar panels along the pipeline and creating large ponding basins in the southeast, to hold floodwaters, with the water being moved along the pipeline to make room for otherwise flooding waters. Creates thousands of jobs for pipeline workers and reduces the billions of dollars spent every year in flooding from hurricanes, severe rainstorms, and the like. It's kind of like that idea. I think it came out of actually UC Merced, where they were putting solar panels above over the canals as a way to generate electricity, but also, I guess, less evaporation for the water in the canals. And so it's like a double benefit. It seems like a quirky idea to use the oil and gas pipelines to move water, but maybe this is an idea.
I mean, it's an idea that's not yet, it won't come to fruition anytime soon, but it may be a direction for us, depending on what other decisions are being made. because every decision has its consequences. And I noticed someone in the chat was mentioning, the power costs right now. I mean, none of this is happening right now with the power costs. None of this is because we haven't really figured out our renewable generation. I mean, I do want to have one really encouraging point. We did run, one of the things in the report is, for a very brief amount of time, California was almost entirely on renewables. This was earlier this year in April, so we're not there yet. We still need more storage and batteries. We need a lot more to come into that infrastructure, but if we can get the energy solution right, then we're going to have a lot more flexibility.
This is a peripheral topic, but somewhat related. As we're talking about fallowing land, I mean, there have been some discussion about that. I've heard anywhere from 500,000 acres to 1.5 million acres of productive farmland being fallowed. That's obviously a troubling concern. But the other point is, what is the economic return for those farmers who do have to fallow land because they can't get water? Does carbon sequestration and or solar panels, does that generate enough revenue for those farmers and enough jobs for those former farm workers to keep those local economies going?
Yeah, that's these are the questions we need to be asking. Is what is a viable alternative future? One of the things with the solar. Well,
I'm sorry. One of the just the implications of that is, if these small cities don't have the generating taxes and revenues from agriculture now, if that agriculture is displaced, then that revenue goes away, right? Who provides the money for the fire department, the police department, the library, the schools, et cetera? So that there's a lot of issues here.
No, there are, and that was unfortunately the scenario that I didn't speak much about, which was selling the farm, which is, we don't make these kinds of investments now. We don't try out new things now, and we kind of wait to see what happens. Then we may indeed begin to lose, communities. And we're already seeing some of that, and that's what's so discouraging. We're seeing, schools shrinking in certain areas because there simply is not enough available job opportunities, so there's less families in that area.
Right.
Yeah. Would you like me to respond to any of the questions
I just was seeing one here about, usually think about competition with Mexico and Canada. One here is talking about cooperation. What are your thoughts on that besides shifting crops?
So it's a great question. It's a great question. And one of the things that we already see is, of course, some of the agribusiness that is in, particularly in Mexico, is California based. It's kind of a joint operation. So we have companies here that have business in Mexico who are then selling into the California market. And I think there are opportunities. We don't have necessarily from a trade perspective, because one of the big challenges here is that you might have the food ministries, but then you have the trade ministries, and they're not the same decision makers. The trade ministries, they're trying to get as much exported as possible, where there may indeed be opportunities to have a win where, it makes sense. Some things may not make sense to grow in California or Canada that makes sense to grow in Mexico, vice versa. We may indeed have opportunities that could be pursued trilateral trade arrangements.
I think with that cough, John wants to ask a question. So, John, go ahead.
Thanks, Mark. Anastasia, wonderful presentation. There's a huge river to our north that nobody ever talks about called the Columbia. Why aren't we tapping it? It's huge. We wouldn't need a very long pipeline, and then use gravity to bring it down, like through the Shasta Dam and then into our existing system. It's maybe a 200-mile pipeline if we could tap into it. And if you go across the Columbia at Portland, it's like a mile wide. That's all wasted water, and it's not agricultural land because it's forest land. So it just goes out. That's all unused water. And I don't hear anybody ever talking about that. Take it on.
Thanks, John.
No, thanks for sharing that. I mean, the Columbia, of course, has a lot of different stakeholders on it. And so that would require a great deal of negotiation, I imagine, to begin to sort of explore the possibilities. Because there's, of course, some tribal stakeholders and the various cities, and, you know, a fair amount of power is generated off of the Columbia. But it doesn't mean that it wouldn't be feasible to sort of explore that and sort of see whether that is what additional water there may be that could indeed, for the time being, you know, before we can repurpose our fossil pipelines.
You know, that's you're mentioning in your report how complex the water rights are in California. And one of the very first assignments I had as an attorney many years ago was to a senior partner came into my office and said, I need to look up, you know, the riparian rights of this school district. And I was like, what's a riparian? So that's, you know, it was a long time ago, but it's incredibly complex. And that adds a whole nother layer. We do a lot of different areas, and I have to get myself up to speed on a lot of different areas on public policy to do these webinars and programs. And I'll tell you, water and water rights, probably among the most complicated areas to really follow. It really is. It's just a Christmas lights to put it into the holiday season. The Christmas lights kind of thing you have to unwind and untangle. It's a lot to deal with there. Now I want to ask a question. Mas Masamoto, who is one of our favorite and most famous Valley farmers, asks a question here. What different farming regions of the state do you see excelling in the future? The San Joaquin Valley in a good or poor place? Central Coast, Napa, Sacramento, et cetera. What are your thoughts on that, and why?
No, that's an excellent question. I think a lot of it has to do with what scenario we end up in. I mean, it really, really has to do if we can do climate adaptation. If we can do climate adaptation, the San Joaquin is the powerhouse of our agricultural production, and we'll be able to continue doing that. Will we be doing it the very same way we're doing it today? Probably not. But that's where the challenge lies. I don't see this as necessarily being a migration of agriculture. And the reason being, of course, is that, you know, where the farmland is located, where our key prime farmland is. Our prime farmland is currently.
Yeah, and my understanding, again, I'm probably showing my ignorance here, but my understanding is that soil is rated, and that the soil in the San Joaquin Valley is among the best in the world. And so I would think that would mean that we have the most to benefit if we can address these challenges and keep this farmland in production. Again, I would go back to the point being that I think it's a national security issue, that it's more beyond just an economic issue. It's really national security to maintain food production in the United States. You don't want to be reliant on Canada or Mexico or other nations to provide our food supply.
I agree with you. I mean, the Central Valley right now, Mark and I were talking about this, close to 25% of US food is coming out of the Central Valley in terms of our fresh foods.
That is an amazing statistic. I mean, people just stop and think about that. 25% comes out of what, 7, 8, 9 counties in California. Amazing number. Well, we're almost out of time here. I see John, do you have your hand raised for a second question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay. I know something that you guys don't. When I worked for Caltrans, our district director at the first time I worked for them was Bart Bond. Bart is a retired colonel from the Corps of Engineers, Army Corps of Engineers. And guess what? His river was the Columbia River. Now, I think Mark knows, or Mark probably knows Bart.
I do.
If not, I can communicate.
I'm that old, John.
What? Okay, so maybe we could do something, another presentation along that with Bart and Anastasia. Again, discussing the Columbia River issue, maybe.
One of the things you might want to think about is speaking with Ellen Hannock at the Water Policy Center at the PPIC. They've done a lot of work. It'd be interesting to see what their thoughts are on this. I know they're well respected in this area. So anyway, I don't see, I'm looking here to make sure I'm not missing anyone. I don't see any other questions. Does anyone have any final questions for Professor Telesetsky before she leaves?
Yeah, or any other thoughts, because there are a lot of things. I mean, if you're interested in the report, there's a fair amount of discussion about things the use of CRISPR. I'm actually very optimistic about the use of CRISPR in terms of being able to develop crops that might be able to withstand drought. You know, there's a lot of promise there.
By the way, you were saying that, I apologize, you were saying about the cooling period, or freeze period for pistachios was how many hours?
700 to 1,000.
Yeah, that's interesting because from upstate New York originally, and I've been bugging my wife for 20 years about, I wanted to plant an apple tree. And she said, apples don't grow in the valley. But I found that the Pink Lady variety, which was developed in Western Australia for hot areas, only needs, I think, 400 hours of chilling hours. So I will let you guys know if I have planted a Pink Lady in my backyard, and we'll see if that thing bears fruit. But I'm hoping maybe we can start a whole apple culture here in the Central Valley with a crop that works with lower chill hours. Alex, you want to answer? I'll give you the honor of asking the last question. Alex, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Keppler. You mentioned earlier thinking about this issue as a national security priority, and I was reminded that I wanted to get our speakers' thoughts on it. The issue of foreign nations purchasing ag land throughout the United States, and you also mentioned the use of CRISPR and the potential for it being utilized in bioterrorism. Is there any thoughts on that?
Well, I didn't say it would be used for bioterrorism. I said it would actually be a useful technology because it might actually...
I meant the potential, sorry.
Oh, I got you. Okay. I'm troubled. I am highly troubled by when foreign entities purchase agricultural land, because we have kind of a trend of this, particularly in places like the African continent, of these purchases, and they're problematic because they often lead to displacement of other users of that land. So that's something that I do think is a security issue that a state should be able to have key food production areas. I am optimistic though that CRISPR will be used for good purposes, But having said that, I do think there needs to be regulatory oversight. I think this shouldn't just be a kind of free for all that you sort of experiment. Each producer is experimenting by themselves.
You know, we only have about a minute or two left, but I did want to get this last question in because Masmoto was asking. I don't know if you know Mas, but Mas is famous for his peaches, among other things. He asks, if you were a farmer, what would you grow for the future?
I love this question. I'll be honest, if I was to start in farming tomorrow, I would probably be exploring indoor farming. I would be exploring that, you know, and growing nutritious food, nutritious organic food, greens, because one of the big challenges, frankly, and I didn't talk about this in this presentation, I know we're out of time, we have a bunch of food deserts here in California. We have people who do not get adequate nutrition, you know, fellow Californian residents. And this may provide opportunities, particularly in urban environments. The indoor farming may provide opportunities for more people to get more nutritious food.
I have to tell you, when you talk about indoor farming, I can't help but think of the movie The Martian, where he's planting things inside. So that may be our future. I want to thank Professor Anastasia Telesetsky from Cal Poly for joining us and giving us an overview of California agriculture and what might be happening in the future. Thank you very much for your time. This is going to be our last Maddy Associate Lunch Speaker Series for the year. So I want to wish everyone happy holidays, and we'll see you in the new year. Thanks again.